In the last 5 years, more than half of the Pentagon's discretionary budget didn't go to soldiers' paychecks or veterans' hospitals or your local bridge that still needs fixing. It went straight to private companies. $2.4 trillion contracts, purchase orders, task orders signed in your name, paid with your taxes, booked as someone else's revenue. And here is the part that should bother you. This wasn't a one-off wartime emergency. This was the baseline. A system so stable it can turn missiles, drones, and battlefield logistics into something that looks financially like a subscription business. So ask yourself, when a government spends like this, who is the customer and who is the product? How much of the forever war was about security and how much was about building a permanent market? And if the share of Pentagon spending going to contractors climbed from about 41% in the 1990s to about 54% today, what exactly happened inside that black box? Who rewired the incentives? Who got rich? And why does the machine keep accelerating even after the last troops come home? Stay with me, because by the end you'll understand the real business model behind modern war and the one place, hidden in plain sight, where the system quietly admits what it is. Hold on to that number, 54%. We're going to come back to it when the story gets uglier. At first glance, the military-industrial complex sounds like a Cold War phrase, like black and white footage of smokestacks and men in suits, but it never really died. It evolved. It learned. It modernized. And after 1990, after the Soviet Union collapsed and America was supposed to cash in a peace dividend, it found a new way to justify itself, not by preparing for a single world-ending war, but by turning a chain of smaller conflicts into a permanent revenue stream. The warning most people quote comes from Dwight Eisenhower in 1961. He told Americans to guard against unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex, and he said the danger of misplaced power could persist. It's an elegant warning, almost polite. But listen to what he was really describing, a feedback loop. Money creates power, power shapes policy, policy creates more money. If you're a company inside that loop, you don't need to win a war. You need the loop to keep spinning. Fast forward to the early 1990s. The Cold War ends. The U.S. military starts shrinking. Defense budgets slide. And if you're a major contractor, if you're Lockheed or Martin Marietta or Northrop or McDonnell Douglas, this isn't just a tough quarter. It's an existential problem. You build things that only one buyer wants. Your factories are specialized. Your engineers aren't easily repurposed into, making microwaves. When the Pentagon says, "We're cutting procurement," your entire organism starts to suffocate. So in 1993, something happened at the Pentagon that still feels like a scene from a corporate thriller. A private dinner, top defense executives invited in. And the message described by insiders as blunt was basically, the money is going down and you should consolidate fast. They called it the Last Supper. And whether you believe the dinner caused consolidation or just accelerated what was already coming, the results are hard to ignore. By the late 1990s, an Air Force magazine analysis described how the Big Five aerospace firms incorporated what, not long ago, were 51 separate companies. 51 primes compressed into a handful of giants. This is where the first lever of the trillion-dollar war business gets installed: concentration. Because if you're the Pentagon and you want competition, you need options. Multiple suppliers, multiple bids. The ability to punish one company by choosing another. But a consolidated industry doesn't work like that. In a consolidated industry, you don't choose between 10 healthy competitors. You choose between 2 and sometimes 1. And when a crisis hits, you don't have time to build a new industrial base from scratch. You go to the companies that already exist, which means the crisis doesn't just increase spending, it locks in incumbents. Now, here is the part that gets missed. Even in the 1990s, this supposed peace dividend, decade the Pentagon was already leaning on private contractors. Over the 1990s, contract spending averaged about 41% of the Pentagon's budget. And early in that decade, it was lower, closer to the mid-30s. So if you're hearing 41%, Don't imagine a government only dabbling in outsourcing. Imagine a government already paying almost half its defense budget to private companies, then steadily deciding to pay more. But the 1990s did two things at once. First, they shrank the number of firms capable of building complex major systems. Second, they normalized the idea that the Pentagon could buy war as a service, IT, maintenance, training, facilities management, logistics, even private security in certain corners. War was starting to look less like a national emergency and more like a supply chain. And then came the first major test of the new post-Cold War order, the Gulf War. The Gulf War was short compared to what came later, but it was televised, technology forward, and it signaled something powerful to both Washington and Wall Street. Modern war could be run like a high-end production line. Precision munitions, satellite guidance, rapid deployment, and behind the scenes, a growing dependence on contractors to move, feed, repair, and supply the machine. But the Gulf War also taught something else, something strategic and quietly financial. If you're a weapons manufacturer, you don't sell a war, you sell a program. A missile isn't a one-time purchase. It's a system. The launcher, the radar, the software, the upgrades, the training, the spares, the integration. And then, crucially, the maintenance, the sustainment. That is the first pivot people miss. The product of war is not victory. The product is the platform. Now take a breath, because this is where the incentives start to warp. A government can run its own logistics. It can keep a standing workforce. It can build internal capacity. That's messy, but it's accountable. When it outsources, it buys speed and flexibility sometimes. But it also buys something else, a structure where every additional task becomes an invoice. And the invoice doesn't care whether the strategy makes sense. In the late 1990s, consolidation and outsourcing are still manageable as themes. You can still tell yourself it's efficiency. It's modernization. It's the private sector doing what it does best. And history hands the system a gift wrapped in fear. September 11th. In 2001, the U.S. government didn't just go to war. It built a new financing channel for war, emergency supplementals, and then the label Overseas Contingency Operations, OCO. In plain terms, money that could be spent outside normal caps, justified by urgency and catastrophe. Years later, congressional researchers summarized what happened. Since the 9/11 attacks, Congress appropriated around $2 trillion in discretionary budget authority designated as emergencies or for OCOGWOT. $2 trillion. And the deeper issue wasn't only size, it was the rules. Because that kind of funding can be excluded from normal budget control limits. It becomes, in practice, a parallel budget. Here's a household analogy, because this is the kind of mechanism that sounds boring until you realize it controls your life. Imagine your household has a regular budget. You argue about rent, groceries, bills. Then you create an emergency credit card. At first, it's for real emergencies. Hot water heater breaks. Car dies. Fine. Now imagine the emergency card becomes the normal way you live. Groceries go on it. New phone. A vacation. And because it's an emergency, you stop comparing prices. You stop asking if you can fix things in-house. You stop noticing the interest. That's what happens when contingency war spending becomes routine. It doesn't just increase spending. It corrodes the discipline that normally limits spending. Even the critics inside Congress use blunt language calling OCO a loophole, a gimmick, even a slush fund as it morphed beyond combat-specific needs. Now we can talk about how war becomes a trillion-dollar business, because this is where the contractor share explodes and where specific companies become characters, not just logos. During the 2000s, the share of the Pentagon budget obligated to contracts rises into the low 50s. The Pentagon becomes, in large part, a purchasing office. And when you fight two major wars, Afghanistan and Iraq, while running a global counterterrorism campaign, outsourcing isn't a side note. It becomes the operating system. Here's what that looks like on the ground. In Iraq and Afghanistan, contractors didn't just support the U.S. military. They became part of the footprint. In March 2011, the Pentagon had more contractor personnel in Afghanistan. Start with the obvious top tier, the weapons giants. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon now RTX, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics. For decades, these firms have been the core of American arms production, and by the 2000s, they're not just selling weapons, they're selling an entire ecosystem. Look at their own filings, and they will tell you in calm legal language what the business really is. Lockheed derived about 73% of its net sales from the U.S. government in 2024 to 65% from the Department of Defense. The F-35 program alone generated about 26% of Lockheed's total net sales that year. Northrop Grumman derived 87% of its sales from the U.S. government in 2024. General Dynamics reported 69% of consolidated revenue from the U.S. government. Boeing, even with its huge commercial division, reported 42% of its revenues were earned pursuant to U.S. government contracts in 2024. RTX has also disclosed that its U.S. government revenues largely result from contracts awarded under U.S. government programs, primarily defense-related programs with the DoD. This isn't just doing business with government. It's dependency, one buyer, one political system, one set of incentives. Now, hear us a question that should make you uncomfortable. What happens to corporate strategy when your primary customer is a political institution that is rewarded electorally and bureaucratically for never appearing weak? You don't design products to end wars. You design products to fit doctrine, to fit procurement cycles, to fit congressional districts, to fit the next perceived threat. And the perceived threat is where things get malleable. But war isn't only missiles and jets. The war on terror created a second tier of winners, companies that don't build weapons, but build the infrastructure of occupation. This is where names like Halliburton's subsidiary KBR, and later a galaxy of firms providing security, intelligence, translation, and reconstruction services become central. Because occupying a country is not just a military problem, it's a logistics and administration problem. And those problems produce endless billable tasks. Let's take KBR because it's the cleanest window into the mechanism. Under the Army's LOGCAP 3 contract, KBR provided logistics support for U.S. military operations in contingency environments overseas, including in Iraq. The work was performed under task orders, many issued as cost-plus award fee task orders. That phrase cost-plus award fee sounds technical. It is, and it's also the kind of detail that decides whether you get ripped off. Here's how it works, stripped to the bone. The contractor gets reimbursed for costs, then it gets a fee. The fee may be tied to performance, at least in theory, but it's still cost-plus. Spending more doesn't automatically hurt the contractor the way it would under a fixed-price deal. And the U.S. government knows this is risky. The procurement rulebook basically admits it. There is language in the federal acquisition, regulation about how certain cost-plus structures provide only a minimum incentive to control costs. Minimum incentive. In plain English, you are paying a company in a way that doesn't strongly motivate them to keep spending down. Now imagine trying to run that kind of contract in a war zone. GAO warned that the Pentagon's extensive use of logistics support contracts creates oversight challenges and recurring contractor problems. Poor cost reporting, difficulties meeting schedules, inadequate controls over purchasing. That isn't abstract. That's lost money. That's delayed support. Sometimes it's worse. It's way so obvious it becomes political theater. KBR has faced multiple allegations and legal actions over the years tied to Iraq-era contracting. In one Department of Justice settlement agreement related to LOGCAP 3, the government described how work under the contract often relied on cost-plus award fee task orders, and it laid out allegations that employees rigged subcontract bids and accepted kickbacks with costs, then charged back to the U.S. government. The settlement resolved those allegations without an admission of liability, but it also put on paper what the system keeps pretending is rare. In a war zone, money leaks. And then there's another number that matters for a different reason, $108.75 million. KBR publicly announced a settlement of a legacy legal matter for that amount, describing it as related to accusations of fraud tied to Iraq War logistics contracting while denying liability. Now, I'm not telling you this because the exact settlement figure is the story. I'm telling you because this is what war as a business looks like in practice. Not a dramatic villain twirling a mustache, but spreadsheets, subcontractors, warehouses, and invoices. Here's the ugly truth. In a war zone, it can be rational, even necessary, to outsource. You need speed. You need capacity. You need people who can build things and move things fast. But that same environment is the perfect place for waste to hide, because oversight is harder, records are messy, and everything is urgent, which is a polite way of saying, stop asking questions. Now, let's go one level deeper, because logistics contracts are only part of the outsourced war machine. The next layer is private security. In September 2007, Blackwater contractors in Baghdad opened fire at Nisr Square, killing 14 unarmed civilians and wounding others, a case that later led to U.S. federal convictions for 4 former Blackwater employees. This isn't a procurement scandal, it's blood. And it reveals something essential. When you privatize war, you don't just privatize costs. You privatize force. You hand weapons and authority to people whose employer is not the Constitution, but a corporate management chain. And then you wonder why accountability collapses. The outsourcing went even further into morally radioactive zones. In the wake of the Abu Ghraib scandal, years of litigation and reporting forced public attention onto the role of civilian contractors in detention systems places where accountability was already eroding. Witnesses and investigators raised questions about contractor involvement in abusive environments, and the legal aftermath dragged on for years. Here's the uncomfortable point. Outsourcing doesn't just move work from public to private. It changes the way responsibility behaves. It becomes slippery. It becomes deniable. It becomes litigated. And when responsibility becomes deniable, the system learns the wrong lesson. It learns it can survive its own scandals. Because yes, there were hearings. There were reports, GAO, inspectors general, angry speeches. Then the money kept flowing. Why? Because outrage is emotional. Contracts are structural. And structurally, the post-2001 system did 3 things that locked in the profit model. First, it normalized extraordinarily high Pentagon budgets without requiring a clear definition of victory. Afghanistan didn't have an end state like Germany surrendering. It had milestones, metrics, capacity building, and shifting strategies, all of which generate continuous work for contractors. Second, it turned war into a pipeline of tasks. Build a base, secure a convoy, train local forces, provide translators, maintain drones, run data analysis, upgrade communications. Every task becomes a procurement action. Procurement actions become revenue. Third, it moved war into domains that are inherently contractor-heavy: surveillance, software, data, intelligence analysis, cyber. That's where the next class of firms thrive. This is where companies like Booz Allen Hamilton, Kachi, and Leidos become central. These are not side characters. They are inside the national security apparatus. Booz Allen has disclosed that U.S. government agencies accounted for 98% of its revenue for fiscal year 2024. CACI reported that federal contracts accounted for about 95% of its revenues in its fiscal 2024. Leidos reported 87% of revenues in its fiscal 2024 from U.S. government contracts. These firms don't need bombs to fall to make money. They need the mission to continue. They need ongoing requirements. They need threat briefings that turn into program budgets. And that is why the war on terror era is so important. It didn't only produce spending. It produced institutional habit, the habit of treating war as continuous operational demand rather than an exceptional national decision. Now we reach the midpoint twist. the part that changes how you see the 54% number. Because 54% already sounds insane. But what if it's conservative? A 2025 analysis of Pentagon spending from 2020 to 2024 found that contractors received about $2.40 trillion, roughly 54% of the Pentagon, as $4.4 trillion in discretionary spending during those 5 years. 5 companies alone, Lockheed Martin, RTX, Boeing, General Dynamics, and Northrop Grumman, received about $771 billion in Pentagon contracts in that same 5-year period. Almost 1/3 of all contract awards concentrated into 5 corporate balance sheets. To make those numbers concrete, look at the scoreboard for that single 5-year window. Lockheed Martin alone accounted for roughly $330 billion in Pentagon contract awards from 2020 to 2024. RTX, the company that now includes Raytheon's famous missile and air defense business, took about $145 billion. Boeing received about $115 billion. General Dynamics about $116 billion. Northrop Grumman about $81 billion. Add those together and you get about $771 billion rooted to 5 corporate giants in 5 years, roughly 1/3 of all Pentagon contract awards in that period. Now compare that to what the U.S. spent on diplomacy, development, and humanitarian aid across the same years, about $356 billion, excluding military aid. In other words, the government invested more than twice as much money into 5 weapons companies as it did into the civilian tools that are supposed to prevent wars, stabilize regions, and keep crises from spreading. And if you think this is a wartime spike, the same analysis points out something even more sobering. By 2025, published estimates and enacted add-ons pushed annual U.S. military spending beyond the $1 trillion mark. If the contractor share holds anywhere near the 2020s average, that implies a transfer of well over $500 billion a year to private contractors. The report even breaks down annual contract totals for those 5 firms. For example, Lockheed's contract awards were in the tens of billions each fiscal year in that period, dwarfing competitors. But then it makes a chilling point: the public data is incomplete. Intelligence agencies are exempt from reporting many contract obligations to public procurement databases. Budgets are disclosed as top-line figures, but details are secret. In 2024, for example, the National Intelligence Program disclosed a top-line budget figure, while explicitly stating there would be no other disclosures of currently classified budget information. Similarly, the Military Intelligence Program released a top-line figure and made clear that other details would remain classified. So when analysts adjust for classified intelligence funding, basically asking, what happens to the contract share when you remove spending you can't meaningfully see? The estimated contract share can rise to about 61% for 2020 to 2024. Let's translate that. In the part of government where secrecy is highest, where democratic oversight is weakest, the contractor dependence is likely higher, not lower. So when politicians and pundits talk about government spending on defense, the more accurate phrase might be government spending through private companies, including in places where you can't even see the contracts. And once you see that the story isn't only about war, it's about a transfer of power from public institutions to private vendors, justified by national security. Now, here's the next twist, more psychological than mathematical. Most people imagine the war business model as war breaks out, companies profit, war ends, profits fall. But the real model is the inverse. The modern defense economy is built on long timelines, decades. A fighter jet isn't purchased once. It's paid for and maintained and upgraded and supplied and serviced until the pilot who first flew it is long retired. Take the F-35. Even if you never care about aviation, care about what it represents. The U.S. plans to use the F-35 through 2088. Auditors have tracked how projected sustainment costs for the fleet rose from about $1.1 trillion in 2018 to about $1.58 trillion in 2023, alongside concerns that the aircraft is flown less than originally planned, partly due to reliability issues. That's not wartime spending. That's annuity spending. And it means one of the most profitable parts of war can happen after the invasion stops. Maintenance contracts, software updates, supply chains, training, and basing requirements that never quite wind down. This is how peace gets financially redefined. Not as the absence of conflict, but as the continuation of readiness programs. So, what happens when the U.S. withdraws from Afghanistan in 2021? Does the machine slow down? No. It rebrands the threat. A 2025 report bluntly noted that despite withdrawal and the scaling back of the war on terror, Pentagon, spending and contractor revenues stayed extremely high, in large part due to the military's focus on China as a major national security challenge and due to surging arms sales tied to wars like Ukraine and Gaza. That's the trick of the system, if you want to call it a trick. It doesn't need one permanent enemy. It needs a rotating set of dangers. In the part of government where secrecy is highest, where democratic oversight is weakest, the contractor dependence is likely higher, not lower. So when politicians and pundits talk about government spending on defense, the more accurate phrase might be government spending through private companies, including in places where you can't even see the contracts. And once you see that the story isn't only about war, it's about a transfer of power from public institutions to private vendors, justified by national security. Now, here's the next twist, more psychological than mathematical. Most people imagine the war business model as war breaks out, companies profit, war ends, profits fall. But the real model is the inverse. The modern defense economy is built on long timelines, decades. A fighter jet isn't purchased once. It's paid for and maintained and upgraded and supplied and serviced until the pilot who first flew it is long retired. Take the F-35. Even if you never care about aviation, care about what it represents. The U.S. plans to use the F-35 through 2088. Auditors have tracked how projected sustainment costs for the fleet rose from about $1.1 trillion in 2018 to about $1.58 trillion in 2023, alongside concerns that the aircraft is flown less than originally planned, partly due to reliability issues. That's not wartime spending. That's annuity spending. And it means one of the most profitable parts of war can happen after the invasion stops. Maintenance contracts, software updates, supply chains, training, and basing requirements that never quite wind down. This is how peace gets financially redefined. Not as the absence of conflict, but as the continuation of readiness programs. So what happens when the U.S. withdraws from Afghanistan in 2021? Does the machine slow down? No. It rebrands the threat. A 2025 report bluntly noted that despite withdrawal and the scaling back of the war on terror, Pentagon, spending and contractor revenues stayed extremely high, in large part due to the military's focus on China as a major national security challenge and due to surging arms sales tied to wars like Ukraine and Gaza. That's the trick of the system, if you want to call it a trick. It doesn't need one permanent enemy. It needs a rotating set of dangers. In the last few years, global arms demand has surged. SIPRI reported that in 2023, 73 of the top 100 arms-producing and military services companies recorded year-on-year growth as higher geopolitical tensions turned demand into revenue. On the arms transfer side, SIPRI's data show Ukraine became the world's largest arms importer in 2024. Accounting for 8.8% of global arms imports because states supplied arms in response to Russia's full-scale invasion. And the U.S. system is built to monetize exactly that environment. The Defense Security Cooperation Agency, the machinery for U.S. arms sales and security cooperation, reported implementing $117.9 billion in arms sales and transfers in fiscal year 2024. It also reported overseeing more than 16,000 foreign military sales cases with an open case value measured in the hundreds of billions. In other words, even when American taxpayers aren't the buyer, the American system can still be the broker and the American primes can still be the sellers. Now bring that global boom back to the domestic contracting numbers, and you can see the modern war business model in full. From 2020 to 2024, private firms received $2.4 trillion in Pentagon contracts. And one-third of that, around $771 billion, went to just five firms: Lockheed, RTX, Boeing, General Dynamics, Northrop. Lockheed led the field by far. If you're trying to understand continuous warfare as a stable business model, this is it. Stable, concentrated, repeatable. So how does a small group of companies keep the pipeline flowing? Part of it is technical lock-in. Once the Pentagon commits to a platform, the ecosystem becomes hard to exit. Parts, training, code, sustainment, upgrades leaving is expensive. Part of it is budget architecture. War funding and contingency designations create spending streams that are harder to constrain. And part of it is political influence. A 2025 analysis noted that as of 2024, the arms industry employed 950 lobbyists. Lobbying, campaign donations, and the revolving door between government and industry aren't quirks. They are how the market is maintained. Watchdog groups have described how the revolving door can undermine competition and performance, lead to higher prices for taxpayers, and concentrate corporate power. And when the market is maintained politically, the customer isn't only the Pentagon, it's Congress, it's committees. It's the appropriations process. It's the members whose districts host factories, subcontractors, and supply chains. That's why the system survives scandal. Scandal is a headline. Influence is infrastructure. Now, I promised you corporate names, not abstractions. So let's paint the corporate landscape as it looks in the 2020s. Lockheed Martin isn't just a defense company. It's a portfolio of programs that stretch across decades. Its revenue is heavily tied to the U.S. government, and its headline program, the F-35, is not only an acquisition story. It's a sustained story that extends deep into the future. RTX, the successor brand that now includes what was Raytheon, sits on missiles, radars, engines, and systems that are suddenly in global demand when wars turn into air defense contests. Boeing is known for civilian aircraft, but it still derives a huge chunk of revenue from U.S. government contracts and builds military aircraft, helicopters, and services tied to long-range procurement. General Dynamics spans tanks, submarines, communications, and IT services through its government IT business, riding both hardware and services streams. Northrop Grumman anchors itself in big strategic programs, bombers, space systems projects where the taxpayer commitment runs long and where the replacement cost becomes a political weapon. You can't cancel it now. We've already spent so much. Then you have the second tier, the war services firms, Booz Allen, Kachi, Lato's companies that are plugged into the same national security budget, but in a different way. They thrive on classified work, on analysis, on system integration, on mission support. They are the connective tissue between data and decision, and that puts them close to power. And then you have the contractors who become famous for the wrong reasons. Companies whose war profits are tied to logistics, reconstruction, and security in the most chaotic environments where oversight is weakest. Now, hear us a detail that makes all of this feel more sinister than it needs to be. When the Pentagon buys a weapon system, the purchase price is only the beginning. The true cost is the software updates, the maintenance, the spare parts, the long tail of sustainment. And that's where profiteering can get grotesque. There was a Pentagon Inspector General review of spare parts purchased from TransDigm, a company that supplies aircraft parts, where the Inspector General found extraordinary profit margins on parts, sometimes in the thousands of %. The point isn't that TransDigm is uniquely evil. The point is that a defense supply chain with low competition and high urgency is structurally vulnerable to price inflation. Now zoom out again, because all these details lead to the question that actually matters. Who pays? First, taxpayers. The Cost of War Project at Brown University estimates the post-9/11 wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria, and elsewhere total about $8 trillion. not including future interest costs on borrowing. 8 trillion doesn't just vanish. It becomes debt. It becomes interest payments. It becomes the excuse for austerity politics, the moment when someone tells you, we can't afford healthcare or housing or education, while the war machine quietly renews another contract. Second, soldiers and their families. War is paid in trauma, disability, and lives. SIGAR's final forensic audit on Afghanistan reconstruction noted more than 2,450 U.S. service members killed and more than 20,700 injured. Those numbers are only one slice of harm. The deeper slice is the prolonged aftermath, the mental health costs, the suicides, the families that absorb the shock wave long after politicians move on. Third, the societies where wars are fought. Afghanistan is the cautionary tale. Later, in a final report on Iraq reconstruction, Congress was forced to confront what happened to tens of billions of taxpayer dollars used to fund rebuilding and what those failures meant for future missions. This is the hidden cost of privatized war. When work is delegated to contractors, accountability becomes contract management. And contract management in a war zone is almost always an afterthought. Now bring all the threads together, because this is where the numbers start to feel like a system rather than a series of scandals. Over the past 35 years, the Pentagon's contract share increased by a decade. About 41% in the 1990s, about 52% in the 2000s, about 53% in the 2010s, and about 54% in 2020 to 2024. That's not an accident. That's a trend line. And once the contractor share reaches the point where contractors receive more than half of Pentagon spending, the political economy shifts. Because now, every budget fight isn't just about national defense. It's about corporate revenue. Every new threat briefing is also a market signal. Every weapons program is also a jobs program spread across states, with subcontractors in hundreds of districts, making it politically harder to cut. Every attempt to reduce spending becomes dangerous because the same firms paying lobbyists and funding think tanks can shape the public argument about what is dangerous. This is why peace dividends don't show up anymore. Not because peace is impossible, but because the system is built to treat peace as a financial risk. So what's the payoff? What do you take away that sticks in your brain the next time you see a headline about a new conflict? Here are 3 mental models. First, war is not just a policy choice. It's an economic infrastructure. Once built, it needs throughput projects, upgrades, deployments, rotating threats to justify its size. Second, the real product isn't the war. The product is the contract. Wars end. Contracts renew. Programs outlive presidents. Third, outsourcing force and strategy also outsources accountability. And outsourced accountability comes back as tragedy, then litigation, then another line item. A system can survive tragedy if the contracts are written so the money keeps flowing. Now, remember the promise I made at the start? The one place, hidden in plain sight, where the system quietly admits what it is. Here it is. Open the procurement rules, the Federal Acquisition Regulation. There's a section describing cost plus fixed fee contracts, and it says in plain black letters that this contract type provides the contractor only a minimum incentive to control costs. Minimum incentive. If you've ever wondered why costs balloon even when nobody is stealing, this is the answer. It's not always fraud. Sometimes it's just math. A contract structure that reimburses costs will naturally attract complex projects with uncertain requirements. Those projects grow, they sprout change orders, they expand scope, they justify schedule slips. And each expansion has a paper trail that makes it look legitimate, even responsible. The work is harder than expected. The threat evolved, the technology changed, and the estimate changed with it. In a world like that, cost growth isn't a bug. It's a feature that keeps the money moving. The system doesn't hide the problem. It codifies it. And then it sends that contract type into environments where oversight is weakest, urgency is highest, and dishonesty is easiest. That's how war becomes a trillion-dollar business. not through a single conspiracy, but through a legal, bureaucratic structure that turns violence into recurring revenue. So the next time you hear that the defense budget is increasing for stability, watch where the money actually goes. Ask which companies will book it as revenue. Ask how long the program will last. Ask whether the incentives reward ending the problem or managing it forever. Because the darkest truth here isn't that war is profitable. The darkest truth is that we've built a version of capitalism that can treat war as a predictable, recurring business cycle with taxpayers funding it, soldiers bleeding for it, and a small circle of corporations collecting the check. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. If you want to understand how that machine manufacturers consent how lobbying, think tank funding, and the revolving door shape what America calls a threat, that's the next layer. That's where the market learns to speak, and that is where the next investigation begins.